Are there any more people in the line for the bathroom? That's it? Okay, we're all here. Before we start looking at the study guide there, I'd like to make a few remarks on the whole issue about recognizing the Dhamma. We've all been exposed to many versions of the Dhamma, and the question is, are they all right? Are they some right and some of them wrong? Are they all wrong? And the Buddha's approach is that some of them are right, some of them are wrong. And he's often quite critical of approaches that were actually opposed to the Dhamma. He's not the sort of person who would go out and pick fights, but occasionally he would go out and ask questions of teachers he felt that were teaching something that was really dangerously wrong. And for him, dangerously wrong meant teaching people that their actions don't matter. Either because there is no cause and effect in the world, or because everything is totally predetermined, that you don't really have any choices. Or you do have choices, but they don't have any effect on the world outside you. And those are the kind of people he would actually go search out. And say, do you really teach this? And they would say yes. And then he'd start questioning them as to why they taught that, and then pointing out the fact that if you believe anything like that, then the whole idea of path to practice makes no sense at all. And why would you have a practice? Why would you teach even if you felt that human action didn't make a difference? So there are times when he would actually go out and argue against other people. And when he defined mundane right view, it was actually the antithesis of a deterministic view. Mundane right view is, there are actions, actions have good and bad results, there is a life after this, and your actions have a role in shaping this life and the next life. And there are actually people who know this. It's not just somebody's opinion, but people who practice rightly. So he would define mundane right view in a way that was totally opposed to determinism. And he was sometimes quite fierce in his arguments, taking people apart. There's one famous case where this one monk went to see this, a member of another sect, went into the Lichavis and said, come and watch me beat the Buddha. And the Buddha's going to be sweating. At least if this post over here could have feeling, I could make this post sweat, he said. And we'll have the Buddha sweating. So he goes, and the Buddha defeats him in about 5 minutes. And then basically thoroughly demolishes him for the next 10 minutes. And then at the end of it, one of the people in the audience says, this is like someone, a crab that has had all its legs removed and the crab can't do anything anymore. So the Buddha could be quite fierce when he was, saw that a particular view was detrimental to people. And it was really opposed to the Dhamma. And letting a sincere person remain stuck in wrong view for him was not an act of kindness. When he would engage people in debate, he would also want to make sure that they really were sincere about finding the truth. If they weren't, then it was a matter of either debating for the purpose of showing someone else who was there, or else he would just let go. One of the famous cases is this old Brahmin who came to pick a fight with the Buddha. He said, well, what do you teach? And the Buddha knew what the guy was, and he just wanted to cause trouble. And so he said, basically, the kind of doctrine in which one doesn't get involved in useless disputes. So the Buddha knew when and where to argue about the Dhamma, but he did argue about the Dhamma, and particularly with monks who were misrepresenting him. There are a couple of cases where the word gets to the Buddha that there was this monk who's been basically saying that what the Buddha taught was not right, or that he, as I understand the Buddha's teaching, this, which was opposed to what the Buddha said. He would call him in, and the Buddha would examine him. And there are a couple of cases where the monk would come around, a couple of cases where they didn't. And the Buddha, again, shamed them in front of the Sangha, and then turned to the Sangha and had kind of a question and answer period where he wanted to reestablish, what actually was the right way to answer that question, and what was the right position on that issue. Because after all, the Buddha didn't have the internet, fortunately for him. But he didn't have, he didn't record his teachings in any way. I mean, it was up to the listeners to remember what he had said. And so if some misrepresentation was getting out there, he wanted to make sure to stop it as quickly as he could. And then to reestablish among all the monks who were present, okay, this is the right way of looking at the Dhamma. That story we had last night about the monks living in harmony You notice that the Buddha asked, are you living in harmony? And they said yes. And then he said, well, what kind of harmony? Because there are times when you decide, okay, we're just not going to touch a particular issue, we're going to pretend that it's not there and get along. And the Buddha said, for that is not genuine harmony. You have to have your views in line with one another, you have to have your virtue in line with one another. That's genuine harmony. So there definitely is a right and wrong versions of the Dhamma. The classic anti-Dharma views that are discussed in the canon, as I said, are determinism, also the view of non-causality. Another view, which the Buddha demolishes, that sex is okay for monks and nuns, and it's okay for teachers to have sex with their students. Another view that he takes apart is annihilationism, i.e. after death there is nothing. Or eternalism, which is that your state is always going to be the same regardless of what your actions are. Now these are the views that he took apart in the canon. There are a number of post-canonical views that are also opposed to what the Buddha taught. He doesn't take them on in the case of a debate, but you see that there are passages in the canon which show that things that eventually developed within the Buddhist tradition really were not in line with what he taught. The first one is Buddha nature. You know, if anyone were qualified to talk about Buddha nature, it would be the Buddha. But he didn't. And he said, basically, questions of being innately good or innately bad, he said, these are wrong views. You can't say that you are innately a good person, it's just your social conditioning that made you bad. Or there is in some of the Pure Land sects the idea that we are innately depraved and we need the Buddha to come down and help us. In both these cases, if you're innately good, what is there to do? It makes you complacent about unskillful things coming up to the mind. So, well, that's not really me, I don't have to worry about it. Years back, I was reading a koan in which the student is told by the teacher, okay, put all the embers out in that fire. And the student goes out and he says, all the embers are out. And the teacher goes in and he takes the tongs and he reaches right in and he pulls out a burning ember. Now I thought, okay, at last, a koan I understand. The teacher tells the student that there's still defilements in there, and the student says there are no defilements, and the teacher goes in and reaches right in and finds something that's remaining there. Well, it turns out that the correct answer was, the teacher had said to look for your Buddha nature. The student couldn't find his Buddha nature, and so the teacher showed it to him. What did he say? So the Buddha never tended to anything about innate goodness or innate depravity. The views that are opposed to striving, the saying that that the more you make an effort, the more you get in the way of actually realizing the deathless, that is also a wrong view. As the Buddha said, there are ways of putting an effort. You're not trying to create awakening, but you're trying to uncover it. John Lee has a good analogy for this. He says it's like the fresh water that's there in salt water. The potential is there for fresh water. But if you take the salt water and just let it sit, no matter for how many hundreds of years, it's not going to turn into fresh water. You've got to distill it. Something's got to be done to get it out. The idea that you have to be open to every new moment, and every new moment is totally different from anything else that has ever been before. That also is not in line with what the Buddha said. It basically said you approach every moment with the attitude of, it's called appropriate attention. Okay, where is the stress here? What am I doing to cause it? What can be done to put an end to that cause? That's kind of a rule across the board. That's an approach you take all the time. And finally, the view that in nirvana is equanimity, which we're hearing more and more these days. And the Buddha said there are many states of mind that are higher than equanimity, and the nirvana itself lies beyond equanimity as well. A person who has attained awakening will show equanimity in certain circumstances, but the equanimity itself is not the awakening. So these are some of the wrong views that we find that have developed within the Buddhist tradition that are against what's in the canon. Another problem is also that a reductionist approach where you say, well, this teacher teaches X, and that's it. Or the teaching is all about X. One of the famous cases, of course, is the thing that we hear about Ajahn Chah teaching nothing but letting go, letting go, letting go. That's not the case. We had the story last night about the banana. There's some things you hold on to until you have to let go of them. There's another story I read about where he'd actually been invited to the palace one time. It was during a period when the students, the university students and the military were at odds, and the students were demonstrating, and they had certain demands, and the military basically wanted to put the demonstrations down. Both sides were appealing to the king for his support. And so he'd invited 3 senior monks from the forest tradition, and John Cha was the third in line. And so he asked each of the monks in turn, okay, what advice they were going to give. And the first 2 monks basically recommended that the king practice equanimity. And it got to John Cha, and John Cha said, well, you've got to practice equanimity, but you've got to do it with discernment. So it's not just letting go. There are other things that you have to think of. In fact, almost any kind of one-word Dharma is going to distort things. We talk about how some people complain about all the lists that the Buddha gives. It's almost like your laundry list for awakening. And the reason he gives these lists, the five hindrances or the 7 factors for awakening, or the 4 bases for success. It's basically because the good qualities you have to work on require a cluster of good qualities. It's not just one is going to handle everything. You've got to have a cluster that you draw on. And the reason he gives lists of the unskillful qualities is there are clusters of them as well. You've got to learn how to take those apart and realize that they're a more complex thing than just holding on or just seeing things in a dualistic way. So when you say that Dhamma is all about mindfulness, all about non-duality, or all about compassion, it's way over reducing the issue. There are a couple times when the Buddha himself would give a one-word answer. That's when he said that all good qualities are rooted in hatefulness. Or when there was one time when one of his students was asking, this Buddha of yours, he never discusses any of the big issues of the day. Is the world eternal? Is the world not eternal? Is it finite or is it infinite? That doesn't seem like he teaches anything at all. And the student said, no, he teaches what's skillful and what's unskillful. That skillful things should be developed and unskillful things should be abandoned. Very concise summary of what the Buddha said, and the Buddha confirmed it later. But when you actually look into what does it mean to be skillful, well, there are lots of qualities that are involved in skillfulness, and lots of qualities that are involved in heedfulness as well. So, when he gives a test for what does qualify and doesn't qualify as a teaching, as a Dharma, he says the teaching is to be measured by the results that it gives when you put it into action. Now there are several assumptions right here. One is that your actions really do make a difference and that you do have the power to change your actions. And also you have the ability to judge the results of your own actions. Now this is an ability that has to be developed. We don't start out right away knowing what's skillful or not. If we did, you wouldn't have to raise kids. The kids have to be trained to notice, okay, when you hit Susie, Susie's going to get mad and she's going to hit you back, at the very least. And then after a while you start teaching compassion. I was thinking, why are you making Susie miserable? I mean, do you like to be miserable? No. Do you like to be hit? No. Okay, well she doesn't want to be hit either. And so this is something we have to be trained in. And so we need standards for judging what is compassion and what does qualify as mindfulness and what does qualify as skillfulness. Years back I was reading an article in Shambhala Sun. It was a very sad article. A Latina woman had been practicing a lot of Tibetan Buddhism. And her son had gotten involved with a gang and then ultimately getting shot and killed. And so she'd have to go through the trial. And then after the trial and everything was over, when the kid who had shot her son was committed, she went on a retreat and she sat down and was trying to spread thoughts of compassion to everybody. And she realized the person she was mad at was not the kid who had shot her son, but the guy who had introduced her son to the gang. And so after the retreat, she went back home and she looked that kid up and invited him over to the house and with his friends and the rest of the gang and got to know them better. And she realized these kids have no adults in their lives, no sympathetic adults. They need a place where they can be with an adult and just kind of talk things over. And so she tried to provide that for them, but she wrote in her article that she really felt at a loss because she didn't know what to say. She felt a lot of compassion, but she didn't really know how to bring compassion into their lives that would be a way that would be effective. Because all she learned, she said, from her teachers was emptiness. No, emptiness is it's not going to help your gang kids. You need a lot more stuff in detail. And so the Buddha gave a number of places, a number of lists of what kind of qualities he's looking for in order to determine what does qualify as Dharma and what does not. And one of the most useful lists is the one that we're going to be going over today, the list in the Gautama Sutta. The qualities of being unfettered, dispassionate, being content, persistent, shedding, and shedding here basically means pride and other unskillful qualities. And then being secluded, being modest, being unburdensome. Now these fall into three categories. The first two, being unfettered and being dispassionate, relate to the goal of the practice. These are the places where we want to go. You want to learn how to unfetter your mind. You have to find out what the fetters are. If you want to be dispassionate, you want to learn what dispassion is and when it is okay to be passionate and what things it's good to be passionate about. And then the other things that you need to develop dispassion for. The second set of qualities has to do with means to the goal, the qualities that you want to develop in order to get to that goal of being unfettered or being dispassionate. There are three in this category. There's being content. There's being content with the material things that you have in your life. Being persistent, putting energy into the practice, and learning how to shed your pride and shed other unskillful qualities. And then finally there's the qualities that have to do with the social impact of your practice. In other words, how does your practice have an impact on other people? And you've got the three qualities of being secluded, being modest. Modest here means that you may have some good qualities, but you don't go around advertising them. Try to keep them quiet. And then finally, being unburdensome. You don't want to place burdens on other people. Now there's some overlap among this. For example, being secluded is also a means of developing good qualities within yourself and shedding unskillful qualities. Of course, it's going to have a social impact. If you have less greed, aversion, and delusion, the other people in your house are less going to be victimized by your greed, aversion, and delusion. So there's some overlap among these different categories. But it is important to realize that the Buddha has you look at these three aspects of your practice. One, where is it going? Two, what do I need to do in order to get there? And three, how do I do it in such a way that I'm having a good impact on the people around me? You have to take all three of those things into consideration. And so what this means is everything has to be tested against several standards at once. Does this actually lead to the goal? And this is also having a good impact on the people around me. There's a story that Ajahn Mahabua tells about how when he was working on the Tadanga practice of not eating any food that was brought after the alms round. And he was very strict with himself about this, because sometimes people might show up late, or they might, whatever. And he stuck with it very, very diligently. And occasionally, though, Ajahn Mun would sneak up and put something in his bowl that had come from somewhere to come later. And he said he didn't do it too many times. It was just enough to remind him, okay, don't get proud around this. Because there's the downside to developing some skillful qualities. Sometimes that you get pride. It gets developed as well. And there are also times when you find that these different standards conflict with one another. For example, being content. You have to make the distinction between being content and actually being persistent. Because there's something, and this is where the Buddha makes the distinction in contentment. Now, if you're content about your material things, that's one thing. Being content about where you are in the practice, I've still got my defilements, but I'm okay. Or the story they tell about Ajahn Chai. After the storm went through the monastery and he came around, there's this one hut where the roof had been blown off. And he asked the monk, are you going to fix the roof? And the monk said, well, I'm practicing contentment and equanimity. And Ajahn Chai said, that's the contentment and equanimity of a water buffalo. Fix the roof. And you have to know, and if you know Thai, calling somebody a water buffalo is about as bad as it gets. And so we have to learn how to balance these different qualities among themselves, so that the practice can be a good practice all around, kind of from all sides. Talking about water buffaloes, I'll tell you one more water buffalo story. Ajahn Lee had a celebration of 2,500 years of Buddhism in 1957. That was 25 centuries of Buddhism. And he had one of his students calculate how many days were there in 2,500 years, and it came up to 900,000 something. And so he had a million amulets made. And then they were handed out. Of course, when you have a million amulets, you've got an awful lot of amulets to hand out. And so he would hand them out by the fistfuls. And there was this one group of soldiers who came to see him one time, and he was handing the amulets out. He said, okay, if the time ever comes when you need help, the amulets will help you, but if the time hasn't come yet, don't test them. Now, this is because in Thailand, sometimes people, when they receive an amulet, will test it. How really good is this amulet? They put it on a tree and shoot at it. And if they miss the amulet, that's a good amulet. And if they hit the amulet, it wasn't worth it anymore. But so they said, okay, we won't test them. But they got drinking on the way back to the army camp. They said, what could these amulets be worth? He was handing them out by the fistful. Let's test them. And so they look around, they see this water buffalo standing in a field. They don't see any owner anywhere nearby, so they put one of the amulets on the water buffalo's horn, and then they step back and they shoot at the buffalo. Ooh. And fortunately, whether it's because they were drunk or what, I don't know, but they missed. The water buffalo was unscathed. And so they, oh my gosh, what have we done? We promised we wouldn't just test these amulets, now we have, what should we do? And so the next time they had the chance, they went to see John Lee. They confessed what they had done. And he said, the reason I told you not to test the amulets is because if a person has, it's only if a person has some good karma that the amulet can help. If a person doesn't have any good karma, there's no amulet on earth that's going to help you. And the reason the water buffalo wasn't hurt was because the water buffalo was better than the people. So those are some of the thoughts I had before we get started on recognizing Dharma. Do you have any questions on what I've said so far? Yes?
You spoke about evaluating an action or a teaching by the results that it bears. The Buddha also spoke about the incredible complexity of karma and the way that things interact. And I was wondering to what extent you can compensate for having good intention, having a good teaching, and yet in an individual situation things not turning out particularly well.
That's why you need a teacher. Someone you can trust and go and talk it over with. It's okay, my intentions were good. I thought I understood the teaching. Was there anything wrong either in my intention or with my understanding? And then you can sort of run it over with somebody else like that.
Is it also possible to view a series of circumstances over time and sort of...
Yeah, some things take a while. You meditate for a day and say, how much better is your mind? And at that point you have no idea. But if you see it over time, you begin to realize, okay, there's a general tendency that's going in a particular direction, then you can say, oh, this has been good for me. And you can also take, there'll be other people who probably start noticing the difference before you do. The people who live around you, they may notice, okay, you're not as irritable as you used to be, or whatever. I'm depending on you all to ask questions. Otherwise, this is going to be very fast. There are a lot of passages in the book, and I don't have to go through all of them, but I thought I'd hit some of the highlights. One of the nice things about this particular collection, I found that as I was trying to find passages in the canon that illustrated these points, but there were a lot of stories. And some of the best stories I think in the canon. I think my favorite one is that one about the prince whose father was killed, who decides not to get revenge. A close second is the one about the nun who removes her eye. But we can get into that later. So what I thought we'd do is first we go through some of the passages that will deal with a little bit more kind of meaty Dharma issues. And then later on in the afternoon we can go back and talk about the stories. Okay. So the first one I'd like you to look at is passage 1.2. This is in the section on dispassion. And when they talk about passion as a fetter, there are basically three fetters that deal with passion. There's passion for sensuality, passion for form, i.e. the states of mind you can get into the jhana, the form jhanas. And then passion for formlessness, and those deal with the formless jhanas. So first let's look at sensuality, passage 1.2. How do you guard the doors of the senses? On seeing the form of the eye, you don't grasp at any theme or details by which, if you were to dwell without restraint over the faculty of the eye, evil, unskillful qualities such as greed or distress might assail you. The same with hearing a sound, smelling an odor, tasting a flavor, touching a tactile sensation, or cognizing an idea. He says, the Buddha has you say, you don't grasp at any themes or details. In other words, if there's some detail in that particular sight, or detail in that particular sound, that sets you off, okay, you don't focus on that. It's not that you don't look or you go around with blinders on your eyes, or decide that you're not going to hear anything at all. You have to notice, when I'm looking at something, what am I focusing on? What are the details I pick up? Okay, then you've got to, if those are the sorts of things that are setting me off, then I've got to learn how not to focus on those particular details and look at other details instead. And this is what contemplation is. Contemplation of the body is about. The practice of goodwill is about. You know, with goodwill, when someone says something it really sets you off, gets you angry, you have to think about, okay, there are other things I can focus on here, aside from the fact that what this person just said is totally outrageous. And we'll get a little bit later on, we'll talk about some of the ways of dealing with anger. But you can start thinking about, okay, this person probably means well, in which case you have to be patient with people who mean well but don't really know what they're doing. If this person does not mean well, you have to feel sorry for them. They're creating a lot of bad karma. In other words, you learn how to re-perceive the situation. Other things that you have to look at are, one, who's doing the looking, who's doing the listening. It's not the case that we're just going through life very passively and all of a sudden something really nasty comes up and it hits us. Sometimes we go out looking for the nasty stuff. And this is why they have hate radio. People want to get worked up about something, so they turn on the radio and get Rush Limbaugh. Now, if you didn't turn it on, there wouldn't be any Rush Limbaugh. You have to want something like that. And people go out looking for things, and basically looking for trouble. So you have to learn, okay, look at yourself. Who's doing the looking in here? And John Lee has that great Dhamma talk where he's talking about the different consciousnesses that might be going through your body right now. You've got all those little worms and germs in your bloodstream, and sometimes maybe they're going through the brain and they whisper something to your brain as they go through. And an idea comes into your mind, and it can take over, and you ask yourself, wait a minute, who is this? Why am I following this? Why do I have to identify with that particular thought? And why do I let that thought do the looking, or why do I let that thought do the listening? So first you have to look at what is my intention in looking to begin with. And this is a good way of practicing mindfulness and practicing restraint as you go through the day. Then the second part that you look at, of course, is if I look in this particular way, what are the results? If I listen in this particular way, what are the results? What are the alternatives? If I look in a different way, listen in a different way.
Ajahn, you said about feeling sorry for someone.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between compassion and pity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how we can move from pity to real compassion.
Okay, compassion basically means the desire to help someone who's suffering, or you want to see them leave their suffering. Realizing that you don't want to leave somebody in a bad situation, but there are times when you have to. There's certain people you just can't help. And in a case like that, it's really difficult to move on to the compassion from the pity. But again, the sense of pity, you have to remind yourself, okay, that person is doing something that I see clearly is wrong and unskillful. Maybe there's somebody out there who sees me doing something that's wrong and unskillful. And they're feeling pity for me right now. So it's not like you're up here looking down on people. We're sort of all here on the same level.
So to bring that sensibility of I could be the person I'm regarding in this way,
Right. Mm-hmm.
can help me move toward a more
Genuine
genuine
compassion.
compassion.
And you can ask yourself, have I ever done anything like that? So, yeah, I've been there. In fact, that's one of the ways the Buddha has you in all circumstances. He says, if you see someone who's really poor, sick, just generally miserable, you have to remind yourself, I've been there. You see somebody who's very wealthy and very powerful, I've been there too. So that helps counteract the pity on the one hand and the jealousy on the other side. As we deal with people, that's okay, we've all been through this before. This is nothing strange. It's a good equalizer. Any other questions on restraint? Yes?
Ajahn, when I think about sort of training the mind or training my attention, meditation, mindfulness or metta. And I'm trying to think hearing you, okay, so restraint of the senses. I can imagine, okay, there's an active training, practicing, doing better at it. I'm trying to put it in, is that like, should I be spending as much time doing that, obviously, it's a relevant question, but is that big things I tend not to walk around thinking, okay, today is a restraint of the senses day. I'm going to like,
Every day is restraint. So, I mean, when you're not on the cushion, are you just not training your mind at all?
No, but I realize, just even in the phrasing of the question, that I tend to sort of go, okay, well, here's a training topic that I'm going to try and be for. And I'm thinking back in the last 6 months, I think, that topic was never
Restraint of the senses.
restraint of the senses as a topic on itself.
Okay, well, it's basically how you keep your mind under control as you go through the day when you're not doing formal practice. Because if you let the mind go out, basically looking for trouble all day, and then the time comes to sit down and meditate, it's okay, everybody, the walls are down. There's going to be a lot of rebellion. And it takes a long time for things to settle down. The image I'd like to use is of a dog you have on a leash. And if the dog is on a long leash, then when the time comes to pull the dog back in, you found that the dog has gone out and wound around a couple trees, a couple people, and a couple benches and lampposts and whatnot. It takes a long time to unwind the dog and get it back to where you were. Whereas the dog is on a short leash, it's right there. Sit down, there you are. And so what you might want to do is, okay, when I'm out going down the street, what am I looking for? Am I looking for something to get, that's going to provoke sensual desire? Am I looking for something that's going to get me upset about something? What do you tend to look for? What do you tend to listen for? And make that kind of the assignment of the day. One of the monks at the monastery was telling me, he suddenly realized that every time he went out into a public place, he was basically looking for where are the pretty girls. This is a monk. It was his first year as a monk. Come on. And just because you put on the robe doesn't mean that the defilements are scared, And so he said, okay, as an exam, as a test, I'm going to go down. You have to go down to the airport to pick up, probably me. He said, okay, I'm going to look for all the signs of aging. And he realized they were everywhere, and he had never paid them any attention. So it depends on what you're looking for. So try to catch yourself. What are you looking for?
I can't remember who gave me this advice, but next time you walk into an airport, try and pay an even amount of attention to every person. Wow, this place is full of people.
It's full of people,
I've never
yes.
seen before.
Yeah.